First of all, I would like to express my deepest gratitude to Professor Itai Sened, Dean of the Faculty of Social Sciences of the Tel Aviv University, and also my deepest gratitude to my friend, Professor François Elbron, professor at Sciences Po, and also president of the Association of the Tel Aviv University. This is a critical and this is a so exciting title on a new world order. I would like to thank, obviously, our speakers that will speak after me. Professor Milete Shamir, Vice President of Tel Aviv University for International Affairs, Dr. Boris Mintz, founder of and president of the Boris Mintz Institute, and of course, Professor Paul Romer, who has kindly agreed to be our keynote speaker. I'm again particularly proud and happy that such a conference is taking place at Sciences Po. As you may know, our institution, our school, our university was founded 150 years ago, precisely in order to try to address the major political, geopolitical, social, and economic issues of the world. It was founded in 1872 by Émile Boutmy after the catastrophic war against France, against Prussia in 1870. And for Émile Boutmy, our founder, that was not just a military defeat, that was also a social and intellectual defeat. And this is the reason why, 150 years ago, he wanted to create a new university based on new principles. The first principle has to do with an interdisciplinary approach. For Émile Boutmy, to understand the world as it was necessary, it was mandatory to have an interdisciplinary approach, combining history, economy, social sciences. And the second principle has to do also with an international approach. Émile Boutmy wanted to promote comparatism. He wanted to have an international approach with a comparison between countries. And I have to say that there is a striking parallel between the situation Boutmy tried to solve and the situation in which we find ourselves today. The trauma of the war of 1870 was certainly great, but it is nothing compared with the trauma we are experiencing now. First of all, I'm thinking, you know that, about the war in Ukraine. The war is back in Europe. This is a new geopolitical and economic framework, and not just in Europe, with international backlashes. At Sciences Po, we tried to take our part. We are welcoming 70 Ukrainian refugees, students refugees. We have delivered a DHC, Doctora Honoris Causa, to Memorial, the NGO that is fighting against the loss of freedom in Russia. We are trying to take our part. The second issue, a dramatic issue, has to do with climate change. There is a new order when it comes to climate change. And the latest IPCC report highlights the situation, and the situation is really dramatic. When it comes to climate change, when it comes to the loss of biodiversity, we need to act now. At Sciences Po, we don't believe about the term of future generations. We do believe that due to the situation of emergency, we are already that generations. And this is the reason why we have launched a new course for the first-year students about environmental transformations. This is the reason why we are changing all the programs of our masters in the wake of the climate change. And this is the reason why also we are hiring around 30 researchers about transformation of climate change. We want to be a reference. We do believe that this has to do with ethics, but it has to do also with professional requirements. War in Ukraine, climate change, they have many things. They are both geopolitical, they are both social, with economic consequences. And you know that the war in Ukraine is also an environmental disaster. These two tragedies are interconnected. If they do not seem to provoke our emotions in exactly the same ways, they are again interconnected. This is part of the new world order, or I may say the new world disorder. As Bruno Latour, our professor, called the situation, we are in a new climate regime, and at Sciences Po, we want to study that new climate regime and all the consequences it has when it comes to social, economic consequences. It is not true that disasters in themselves are enough to capture minds, unfortunately. And this is the duty of universities. Faced with such challenges, universities are more than ever spaces of reflection and intellectual freedom, where research, teaching, and debate must take place. In his 1902 book, a former president of Sciences Po, Anatole Laura-Beaulieu, wrote, "The enemy of the present time is the spirit of hatred and intolerance." The name of the book is The Doctrine of Hate. A century later, unfortunately, we could repeat this sentence word for word. And what our institution has been trying to do for 150 years is precisely to fight against that spirit of hatred and intolerance. To fight against that spirit through study, through research, through reflection, through exchange and debate. Last but not least, faced with a world at a crossroads, we do believe that our new frontier as a university should be also to protect and promote academic freedom, which is truly a foundation of democracy. This is why you know that professors, researchers, and students are so often the first of those who want to deny freedom of thought and expression. I'm thinking about Fariba when I'm speaking about academic freedom. You know that Fariba is a researcher at Sciences Po. She has been jailed for 3 years in Iran, and she is a scientific prisoner. We will not rest until she is free, and for Fariba, for all the researchers and professors who are persecuted, executed, in prison, for all the academic institutions that are threatened, in the European Union, because I'm thinking about the Central European University, which has been forced to move from Budapest to Vienna. We are campaigning now, in the following days, in the following weeks, for them to be awarded the Nobel Prize this year. I very much hope that many of you will join us in that campaign, in that initiative. Thanks again to the speakers, thanks to the participants. Enjoy the conference. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Milet Shamir. I'm the Vice President of Tel Aviv University for International Collaborations. And I'm genuinely delighted for the opportunity to offer just a few words on behalf of Tel Aviv University, which is the convener of this international conference. And first, I would like to extend a very warm greetings to our distinguished speakers and thank them so much for their participation. I would like to express my deep gratitude to our partners, Sciences Po President Matthias Vishra and Provost Sergei Guriev, for their hospitality, for their invaluable collaboration and partnership in making this conference possible. I would like to thank Dr. Boris Mintz for his leadership and unwavering support for gatherings such as this one. And of course, my appreciation as always goes to my friend Itai Sened, Dean of the Social Sciences at Tel Aviv University, whose contagious, I would say, energy was indispensable in bringing us all here today, together with Yuri and Ayelet, who manage the organization on the Tel Aviv University side so brilliantly. I want to share with you that I'm pretty sure that several of us here who arrived from Israel today are happy to be here twice over. We're happy to be here first because we're taking part in this important conference in beautiful Paris. But second, I think we're glad to be here also to get a short break from the political turmoil that has been plaguing Israel over the past few weeks, in particularly around what is now known or referred to as the constitutional revolution or the constitutional reform that the new government is now has put on the public agenda. And I don't know if many of the students are aware of these developments, but there are very serious suggestions now on the public agenda in Israel to significantly weaken the judiciary branch of government, something that people worry about in Israel, whether they're for this proposal or against this proposal. I think many people in Israel share a very deep concern over the growing polarity in Israeli politics and about the precarity of Israeli democracy. As embroiled as we Israelis are in these current debates, we can't lose sight of the larger picture. The fact that our crisis is only one of the latest examples of what Larry Diamond famously called the democratic recession, the consistent weakening of liberal democracy globally in the 21st century. Without a doubt, this democratic recession presents universities with substantial new challenges, and I think the president of Sciences Po has just listed them. Not only because academic institutions are often the target of regimes that are headed towards authoritarianism, as we've just heard from the president, but also because many universities now find themselves struggling to understand what exactly is their role in the face of weakening democracies and democratic institutions. We've just hosted at Tel Aviv University Professor Ron Daniels, who is the president of Johns University, and he recently published a book that's titled What Universities Owe Democracy. In his analysis, modern research universities have a duty to strengthen the democratic societies under which historically they emerged and thrived. Universities, he argues, need to be proactive in 4 ways: as agents of social mobility, as educators of democratic citizens, as providers of accurate, reliable knowledge to the public, and as pluralist hubs for dialogue across political lines. Over the past few weeks, we at Tel Aviv University have been holding multiple conversations about our role vis-a-vis the current debates over constitutional changes. Some of our faculty members have taken action, many of them have. For example, a group of social scientists and law professors are now establishing a designated platform for faculty to share relevant research and expertise and analysis. The idea is to generate position papers on different aspects of the debate that will help clarify complex questions and present reasoned arguments to the public at large, as well as to policymakers. But in thinking about the role of universities in the face of challenges to democracy, an additional dimension of academia, I think, should be taken into account: the existence of an unimaginably vast and varied network of academic collaborations across the globe. Even if we assume that every faculty member has only 2 or 3 connections with colleagues in other countries, and many people in this room have dozens and even hundreds of such connections, then the global grid of academic ties is one of the most elaborate and one of the most widespread networks in existence. And it's also held together, as diverse as it is, by core values shared by most of its members, values such as academic freedom and the importance of the pursuit of knowledge. Again, I'm echoing the president's words from minutes ago. International academic collaborations are a powerful source when it comes to democratic recession. A heartwarming example, of course, is the quick spreading initiatives that occurred just recently to offer refuge in an academic home to displaced colleagues from Afghanistan and then from the Ukraine. Again, so it's so nice to hear about Sciences Po's participation in that. But the international academic network is and can be mobilized in maybe less dramatic but more extensive ways to help meet the challenges to democracy. Researchers in the social sciences, in law, in the humanities, in data science can engage with their international colleagues more extensively than many of us currently do, sharing reliable data, comparing national policies and popular reactions to them, learning from the success and failures of universities in receding democracies, brainstorming solutions, sharing materials for teaching democracy. The potential impact is vast. And that is why I strongly believe in energetically promoting international institutional collaborations at this moment in time. This is also why I think that academic boycotts are not such a good idea. They short-circuit the academic global network and halt collaborations at the exact moment and in exact places would be most helpful. Academic boycotts create disconnections and isolation where solidarity could achieve so much. Our conference today, linking researchers from Sciences Po with colleagues from Tel Aviv University to think together about the new world order, is a fine example of how to strengthen and mobilize academic collaborations in order, and here I'm quoting the mission of the Boris Mintz Institute, in order to promote a significant positive change in the world. I'm very much looking forward to hearing the presentations today and tomorrow, and I wish you all a very successful conference and hoping that we can also build further collaborations on the conclusion of its successful presentations. So thank you all very much.
I have very short speech, very short. Good afternoon. It is a great honor for me to welcome you to our international conference. I want to thank you for your participation and ask for your attention a few minutes, during which I would like to share a couple remarks before we begin. The most important geopolitical event of last year is Putin's aggression in Ukraine. Today, after 11 months, Russian military invasion of the territory of neighboring sovereign state has devastating consequences both for Ukraine and Russia and for all of mankind. The presence of nuclear weapons in the aggressor country turns a military conflict into a crazy act for collective suicides. And here, to the point of view, then the war alleged by Russia in Ukraine is not just a war for the territory, natural and other material resource of a neighboring state. It is an attempt to eliminate the existing civilization world order. A world order based on the fact that all people share commonwealths and interests based on basic freedoms. Unfortunately, we have to admit that Putin is not only politician in the world. His activities are based on the denial of universal values and the desire to destroy the existing civilization world order. All dictators and other populist politicians justify their destructive position with the national interest of their countries. In their understanding, national interest and globalism are not compatible. But this is so only if nationalism is understood as xenophobia. Always, if by nationalism we mean the creation of optimal living condition for all people living in the country, regardless of their age, gender, religion, sexual orientation, then there are no contradictions between nationalism and globalism. Regrettably, Russian aggression in Ukraine has largely violated the existing order established after that of the Nuremberg trials. It undermade faith in international institutions, revealed the helplessness and inability to withstand such challenges. The scarcity of international law has led to the inability of legal entities to enforce the decision of international institutions, primarily on officials who make decisions contrary to international agreements. We also see the lack of any mechanism by international institutions that assure compliance with the existing legal norms by state leaders. We face huge challenges in restoring the system of international cooperation based on the improvement and development of international law. Within the framework of a new, more perfect world order, special attention should be paid to the commitment of people to the national interest of their countries. If Putin's aggression succeeds, its results will be the final collapse of the existing global order. This is my opinion. I think we must remember about it every day. Thank you so much.
The speaker. As the speakers before me already mentioned, this conference is about an extraordinary crisis we are all facing. I must thank Boris Mintz again for supporting this activity, bringing some of the most outstanding minds on the subject to this room and to this event. I must also thank the President and the Provost of Sciences Po for hosting this event so generously. We have with us, and you should all look it up, three of the most important thinkers of our times. So write the date. This is a historic date. We will now hear Professor Paul Romer, Nobel Laureate in economics, and the former Chief Economist of the World Bank. We also have with us Robert Axelrod, who is pretty much reinvented international relations in the 80s with his extraordinary reception, the idea of tit for tat, and everything else is history. And we also have with us Itzik Ben Israel, the person who literally invented the very structure of cyber systems as we know them today. The reason why I mention it is I want all of you to be aware of the importance of the moment, and that we have brought the most outstanding living minds to try and deal with it. And we are going to have the keynote speak today now with Paul Romer. He will talk for about 45 minutes, and then we'll have about 10 to 15 minutes where we will allow you to ask questions. We will encourage you to ask questions. And then tomorrow, we will have a series of short panels concluded by a keynote speech by Robert Axelrod, tomorrow late in the afternoon. So thank you all for coming. And Paul, please.
Thank you to Sciences Po and Tel Aviv. Thank you to Itai for making it possible for me to participate in this very important discussion that we'll have over the next 2 days. Let me start by saying just a word about the tone of my talk, and I'll use the title to make this point. I will talk about the norms that I think are particularly important for a new world order. These are not new norms, these are existing norms. And I don't need to keep you waiting. One of these norms is the norm that traces back to the Treaty of Westphalia that recognizes the notion of the sovereignty of each state and commits states to the principle of non-interference in the affairs of another state. The other norm is a more subtle norm related to respect for the rule of law. And part of the challenge in the talk will be to define exactly what I mean by the rule of law. But so these are traditional norms, but yet which I think will be very important in supporting a new world order. Now, as an economist, there's two ways that people interact with norms. One way would be, in effect, to preach, to say what the individual believes is right from a moral perspective, and to try and persuade others to agree on that sense of what's right and wrong. As an economist, I'm not skilled or prepared or have no credibility in telling you about what's morally right and wrong. What I have those feelings as an individual, but what I do as an economist is tell you about how I think norms and beliefs about right and wrong matter. What's the working out of these parts of the human spirit? And I'll speak about norms in a kind of dispassionate way. I won't try and identify good guys and bad guys. I won't try and say what you should believe is right and wrong. But I will try and convey my belief that I think in practice norms are very important. There's a debate, as I understand, in international relations and the kind of parallel field of international law about the significance of norms. In international relations, the view, which is similar to a view from economics, suggests that norms don't really matter. What matters are incentives and payoffs. People do what is beneficial for them, and norms are kind of talk, cheap talk. From the international law perspective, norms are very important, and stating and making the case for what should be the norm, what should be right, is a very important thing to do because somehow that will translate into changes in behavior. The people from the international relations side who take this instrumental view, I think raise a very important question, which is how is it that norms can actually make a difference? But I think the people who believe norms make a difference, and especially those on the international law side, are convincing when they look back historically, or we look at even practice today, where we see norms influencing behavior. One of the points I want to emphasize as well is that norms change over time. I think one of the great successes that humans can claim is the evolution of norms that said that it's just totally unacceptable morally to enslave other humans. That was not the norm for most of recorded history, and who knows before that. But it's a relatively recent change in norms, and it has changed practice all over the world. So we need to understand not just how do norms influence behavior, but how do they change over time? And then think about whether we can do anything to change norms besides just exhort or preach. Can we do something to change norms to get outcomes that will be better for us all? So with that as preface, let me say that my wife, who happens to be here, who joined us in the front row, she's teaching at Sorbonne this term, studies monarchies. And I learned from her something that I was dimly aware of, but had not paid much attention to. I learned about how much the European system of monarchy ignored national boundaries and ignored nation states. That the House of Windsor in England, for example, used to be called the House of Saxe-Coburg-Gotha, and that many of the members of that family are actually German. And to me, coming from a world where what I know is the world of nation states, it seems bizarre that the process for selecting kings or queens often disrespects the boundaries of the state. Well, what I now understand is that these patterns in European monarchy evolved in a time before the emergence of the nation state, before the Treaty of Westphalia, which really created this modern notion of states that are independent, that interact with each other as peers, but where they commit not to try and interfere inside the other nation. So this pattern of family and marriage ties and people born in one country who can become a monarch in another, this dated the emergence of the nation state. What's interesting to me is to think back before Westphalia, before 1648, and ask, could people living in that time imagine what it would be like to live in a world of the nation states? And I think they probably couldn't have. They probably couldn't imagine what it would be like if the Pope or the Emperor didn't have a say over what was done in each country. And if the king or queen were selected somehow and achieved a kind of authority that was divine in origin without intermediation by the Pope. So the point is that it's very difficult for us to imagine things that we're unfamiliar with. I had trouble imagining what it was like under in a time before the nation state, nationalism, belonging to a nation, was the common practice. But of course, that practice emerged in Europe and has now spread throughout the world. I had trouble imagining what it was like before that. People from that time, I think, would have had trouble imagining what the nation state, what a system of nation states would be like now. And then my wife's work is also focusing on this period in the late 19th century when the system of monarchy started to fall apart. It had the obvious problem that you selected for the head of the nation, the head of the executive authority in the nation, someone purely by their birth. And so you increasingly face this problem of people who were the ultimate anchor for the legitimacy of government, who were poorly suited to that, either incompetent or morally deficient from the perspective of what it takes to be the leader of a country. And so in the late 19th century, there was this period again of a time where the system, where it was the monarch appointed by God or chosen by God who anchored all of the authority of the nation. In the late 19th century, it was clear that that system was going away. People could not imagine what a replacement would look like. One like we have today, where we have elections in most countries to select the leaders. So again, it's very hard to imagine things that we haven't seen before. Even though the United States existed as an anomaly in the late 19th century, I think people still had trouble imagining what would it be like in a system where all countries were like that. So what I want to try and do for you is help you break free of this problem of a failure of imagination. I want to describe what I think is a threat to the current world order. It's the threat of mass migrations that I think could significantly destabilize existing democracies. And some of the conversation already this evening that's pointed to problems that we're seeing in democracies. At least some of this, I think, can be traced back to the very disruptive effects of the prospect of mass migration. So I want to argue that there is a way to move towards a new system that could do better at managing this problem than the one we have now. But I need you to believe that something that doesn't exist now could exist. I want you to imagine some new possibilities. To do this, what I will do is, instead of just presenting a kind of a logical argument, I want to do a little bit of what I'll call political science fiction. I want to describe some stories, tell some very brief stories about things that I think could happen. And then I'll talk about the analytical framework for being systematic about these. So, if the technology works, oh yes, okay. This is an area near a port in Pakistan called Gwadar, if I'm saying it correctly. And in my narrative, the Chinese have been investing in a port in Gwadar and ports that are in other places that are part of the Belt and Road system. The Chinese have realized the basic economic fact that you can never pay for transportation infrastructure by charging people for using it. You can never pay for the subway with the fares that you receive from people who take the subway, but you can pay for the subway when you can capture some of the gains in the value of the land that the subway will create. So the Chinese realize that they cannot succeed with this plan for the Belt and Road unless they start capturing gains in the value of land. And the big gains in the value of land come in city-scale real estate development projects. So the Chinese decide to lease a piece of property in Pakistan that's about 1,000 square kilometers in size, and create a new city that they'll call Shenzhen, and invite up to 10 million or so people to come. Oh, I'll go quickly and switch back, but thank you. So we may have to do a mixed media presentation, but I'll go quickly. So the Chinese lease from Pakistan a place and then attract people from all of Pakistan, from India even, because it's a place where Pakistanis and Indians can actually be safe working together, and it becomes a very successful urban development, analogous to China's own experience with Shenzhen. Okay, next. The World Bank reaches an agreement with Somalia, with whom it cannot transact right now because Somalia is in arrears on its payments to the World Bank. The World Bank leases a piece of Somalia, its southern tip, and in exchange forgives all of the debts to Somalia and starts providing more official aid. The World Bank, as a treaty organization, can lease a piece of a country, just like other nations can lease a piece of a country, as say China did from Pakistan. And the World Bank then hands this region off to the United States and France to develop a new city that could attract people from Somalia, but from other nearby countries, and also to protect Kenya from the effects of the Al-Shabaab gang, which currently operates in this part of Somalia that the government can't control. Based on the success of Gwadar and the improvements in security and opportunity in Somalia, the United States then decides, when faced with a crisis in Venezuela, that what it should do is create an opportunity for Venezuelans to leave Venezuela, go to a new location in Colombia, but not to risk more disruption in Colombia by having these Venezuelans just move in and try and fit into Colombian society. So the US helps arrange for a piece of land that Colombia will own. Colombia will appoint the governor, but where the United States is supportive and where people from 10, 20 million people from Venezuela move and live in safety, get away from dangerous conditions that are emerging in Venezuela. And the world can thereby provide a form of humanitarian relief that does involve invading Venezuela. At this point, Germany gets interested in these possibilities and says, we should do a deal with Namibia as part of our ongoing discussions about the historical activities of Germany in Namibia. We should start a new city in Namibia, and in conjunction with the African Union, make it a place where if there is a humanitarian crisis in Africa, like in Rwanda in the past, or some other place, if there's a humanitarian crisis, it's a place people can go, but it can also be a new city like Shenzhen that provides opportunity and economic growth for people from anywhere in the world. Continuing my quick tour of this new history. The United States increasingly realizes that it's at risk of mass migrations from Central America that it might not be able to stop. So in conjunction with Canada, they set up a new zone on the Canadian-US border where there's some land between in both countries. They set a treaty to set the terms for what it will be like to live in this zone, but they'll treat it the way the British treated Hong Kong. Anybody can move into this zone. They can live there indefinitely, but they do not become citizens of Canada or citizens of the United States by virtue of moving into this zone. And they can do this under their legal systems and international law because treaties take precedence of national law. So US voters who were at first worried that some judge will suddenly make everybody living in this new zone, or at least the US side of it, will make every one of them US citizens, and this will lead to a of people in the United States, those US citizens can be reassured that this can't happen. The treaty between the United States and Canada lets people move in, live in Hong Kong, just as people could move into Hong Kong, live in the zone, just like people could move into Hong Kong without becoming British citizens, and it thereby avoids the risk of a kind of a backlash from people in the United States who are uncomfortable at the prospect of mass immigration at the scale of, say, 10 million people. At this point, Mexico gets interested in as well in what it should do with the potential influx from Central America and with creating new opportunity for people in Mexico. So they start a new city on the US border, but do it in conjunction with Canada and the United States. They have the Royal Canadian Mounties provide the police force there. The policing is sufficient to keep the drug gangs out. They will just go around when they want to cross the border. So it can be a safe city that can provide opportunity for Mexicans who want to go work there, have the benefits of direct trade with the United States, or for Central Americans who need to leave conditions of violence and want someplace to go. And then last, Britain agrees to help foster a conclusion to the war in Ukraine, which involves establishing a new city that I'll call New London in Crimea that could have a port in the lake that is the indentation in this land. It's a piece of land in Crimea that could host more than 10 million people. It's very sparsely settled right now. And as part of the distant resolution of this fight in Ukraine, where people in Crimea have some reservations about the integrity of the government of Ukraine, have the option to move into a Hong Kong-like entity in Crimea that's run by the British. So imagine these possibilities. Every one of these pieces of land, it would be enough to hold more than 10 million people. Several of them I drew so that they could actually hold 20 million people. So we've made places now in the world for 50, 60, 70 million people to leave where they are and go to some place that will be safe, that will give them opportunity, that will immediately create the conditions of the rule of law, just as they existed in Hong Kong. And this will be a way to help the people who want to leave places where they don't have access to the rule of law, and yet accept them into the system of rule of law that exists in other countries without exacerbating the tensions that exist right now that are associated with immigration into the existing political and civil system in existing countries. So this is not the only way to deal with mass migration, or the threat of mass migration, but it's a possible way, and I hope you'll take it seriously and be as creative in thinking about other ways that the world could grapple with this problem. To give you a sense of the scale of the problem, Gallup estimates right now that 750 million people, based on their surveying, 750 million people are that they would leave the country they're in now if they could be accepted someplace else. I think that's actually a potential underestimate because I think the demand is even larger. The underlying cause of this problem is something that I attribute to something that a staff member of Gordon Brown told me, so I call it Brown's warning. Brown's warning is that in establishing the rule of law, the first 500 years are always the hardest. So what we face in the world are a few countries that have managed this tenuous state of having a system of rule of law administered from the top by some leader who is himself or herself subject to the rule of law. They've somehow managed to solve this problem of who guards the guardians and to protect individual citizens, but yet still select leaders who can make decisions at the level of the government, but still have those leaders replaced when they're doing badly, and have a system that selects people where you have some prospect that they will do the job reasonably well. So we have countries where we are in one. I live in another one. The problem is that many people do not have that advantage, and things that we've been saying for decades now about state building basically reflected an assumption that is wrong. It was the assumption that we could create the conditions of the rule of law in a year, or 5 years, or 10 years. And Gordon Brown's probably right. We're probably looking at something more like 500 years. So then we have to ask, what do we say to people who say, I do not live in the conditions of the rule of law, with the rule of law. I want the benefits that you have from it. Are we to say back to them, well, just wait 500 years, no problem. You'll have it in your country. This will not satisfy most people who want to have those benefits for themselves and their children, and who are ready to move now. So we do not, as a world system, have any answer about what to do about this problem. And as I think where this has become a very charged political issue. Elites, like those of us in this room, generally think that immigration into existing nations works just fine. We move around, we're the cosmopolitans. We see no problem, let's just scale that up. But the populists are thinking about numbers like 750 million or billions and saying it's not going to work well when you have immigration at that scale. So one of the issues I have to encourage you to think about, and I'll try and say something about, is who's right here? And why is there so much difference between the elites and the populists? I think the answer is fundamentally one of scale, that immigration at low rates works just fine, but things can go wrong when you have much higher rates. We need to understand what that is and what we can do. So let me just try and reassure you that this future I was describing, this science fiction, has some basis in reality. First, probably one of the best recent, first, one of the questions that you inevitably run into in these conversations is, well, what about urban planning? Aren't there a bunch of badly designed new cities? There are indeed badly designed new cities. Brasilia is the poster child for a badly designed new city. But there are also very clear examples of well-designed new cities. New York City, where they laid out a grid on a barren island where there was nothing but just cows and a few houses, and they said, this is where Fifth Avenue is going to go. This is where 42nd Street is going to be. This is how wide it is. And that's all they needed to do. The greatest city in the world, maybe second after Paris, maybe first, we could argue, grew up, and that's all it takes. Just lay out the grid, define the public space, define the ways that people will interact with each other, the connections where all the pipes and wires and vehicles and pedestrians will go. This is all you need. This is a solved problem. Then ask about how fast could you build a new city? Well, Shenzhen grew to 10 million people in about 30 years. So 30 years is, I think, a reasonable time frame. Shenzhen had real GDP that increased by a factor of 750 over this 30-year period, and also got to the level of GDP per capita of about $17,000 per person. Now, Shenzhen could draw on all of China when it was attracting the young immigrants who built this extremely vibrant economy there, but a new city in Ukraine or Namibia or any of these other locations, Somalia, can draw on huge populations of people who are just as eager to move, just as ambitious, just as talented. And if you do a little math, you can see that the fundamental claim I'm going to make about the economics of this is correct. That this whole system, all these new cities, takes no charity. What you have to do is capture the gains and the value that are associated with the emergence of a city. So assume that in 50 years, one of these cities has, say, GDP per capita of about $20,000. It's got a population of 10 million people. And assume that the government collects either as rent on land which it owns or as some other form of tax, 10% of GDP. In 30 years, that would mean a flow of $20 billion a year. If I discount cash flows at 5%, but I recognize that GDP in the city is still going to grow faster because it's below the frontier of growth. So if it's growing at 4%, you're going to discount at 5% minus 4%, which means at basically a rate of 1%. So in 30 years, this land is going to be worth $2 trillion. Now, do we see cases like that? Well, yeah. Singapore, the people there told me 10 years ago that the land underneath Singapore was worth $1 trillion. It had been worth nothing when Malaysia gave the island away. The land in Manhattan alone is worth more than $1 trillion. So $2 trillion is not an implausible value for the land in this city in 30 years. Then you just discount back, well, if it's going to be worth this land, which is worth essentially nothing, is worth $2 trillion in 30 years. Well, then today it's worth, I don't know, 460 billion we could go out and just borrow against right now and start this project. So the economics of this work because urbanization generates so much value, and part of that gets captured in the land. Part of that is the basis for financing what governments do. And this is indeed what Singapore did to succeed, because Lee Kuan Yew nationalized, expropriated all of the land when he took over. And then all of the gains, that $1 trillion in gain, went to the government in Singapore to then pay for things like the bus system and the subway system and the police that made Singapore such an attractive place to go. So financing this takes no charity. It's just a big real estate development project. We just need to pick some sites. And my pictures convinced you that it doesn't take very much land. The world has a lot of land where we could build new cities. Okay, so now, what are the questions I have to address? If these give you some sense that there's something that's possible involving new cities, why do we need a new world order? Why did NATO support the secession of Kosovo, which was a clear violation of the Westphalian commitment to protecting territorial integrity? I think the answer to both of these is the very disruptive nature of migration flows and the fear that if the violence continued in Serbia and it drove a million people of Albanian ethnicity or origin out, we would see incredibly disruptive effects all throughout Europe. So, and I think this is the threat which the world has not grappled with yet. And if we see the damage that can be done to our somewhat fragile democratic systems, which protect the rule of law, solve the problem of who guards the guardians, we don't want to do something that could completely destroy those systems. So this is why I think NATO compromised on the notion of Westphalian sovereignty. And I think it's clear now why I think state building is not the option. It would take 500 years if the U.S. and NATO had said, well, let's just go into Serbia or Kosovo. Let's just build a functioning state with a rule of law. And we just have made almost no progress, visible progress, over decades in the places where we've tried. Now, I want to be clear, and this is one of these points where I am not making moralistic judgments. The people who were worried about what to do to Kosovo were worried about the loss of life there. They were worried about a humanitarian catastrophe. They're worried about protecting the gem of European democracy and European systems of culture and freedom. But one of the consequences of their decision to override the veto of Russia in the Security Council and move ahead with the recognition of Kosovo over the objections of Russia was a statement by Putin at that time that basically we're going to do the same thing everywhere. We're going to have universal principles. And if you in the West can go in and just carve out a piece of a country, we in Russia can do it too. And they've done it in Transnistria in Moldova, where they're officially as peacekeepers, in Abkhazia and South Ossetia in Georgia, and then in Crimea and Donbass, even before the most recent invasion, where they seem to be ready to take over all of Ukraine. So if you think about this action-reaction dynamic, I think you get very worried about a world where we agree, well, borders don't mean anything anymore, and any country can unilaterally decide to go, or on some pretext of doing something that's humanitarian in motivation, go disrupt and change borders. So I think that despite what you might have thought if you've heard about charter cities before, I actually think protecting the Westphalian commitments to borders that cannot be changed is very important to the whole world going forward. Important if we stay on the track we're on. It's important on any new track that we pursue. Now, the other questions I have to address are why are norms so persistent? Why does it take 500 years? If the rule of law is better, and the people want to leave places where they don't have the rule of law, want to have the rule of law, why don't they just create the rule of law? Why does it take 500 years? I think the answer is that it takes a certain set of norms to protect and instantiate the rule of law, and it's very difficult to change norms. Now, the reason why it's difficult to change norms is not the reason I think many people think. Many people think that the change process for norms is on a generational time scale, that one generation is taught something by their parents, and then their children will teach the next generation. So there's a very slow generational time constant in terms of when are the opportunities you get to change norms. I think that is not the dynamic that matters for norms, because we see norms change very quickly sometimes. And we know that when you move a person from one system with a given set of norms to another system with different norms, people acculturate very quickly. So this is what the elites see when they say, what's the problem? Just let everybody migrate into all of our systems. They'll become like us. It's no big deal. At the individual level, we're very influenced by our peers. So the norm transmission process is not mostly vertical from parent to child. It's mostly horizontal from peer to peer. So if the question is, if we just can put one person amongst a bunch of peers who say, believe in the rule of law, or believe in, take something simple, believe in waiting for the traffic signs to say walk before you walk across the street. You put one person into that culture, that person changes very quickly. But if you've got a whole culture of people who are all reinforcing each other through this conformist mechanism, it's very hard to stop the process of the existing norms replicating themselves over time. So at the individual level, we're very flexible and things can change. If you could change everybody quickly, then they would reinforce each other and away you could go. So it is possible to get to something like norms about changing behavior at street crossings or changing beliefs about the rule of law. It is possible in principle, but you've got to create the right conditions for this kind of phase change where you change everybody at once. Now, this is what I think new cities offer as their biggest potential benefit. If Hong Kong were to, or the US and France were to start a new city in the southern tip of Somalia, but they said, we're going to be in charge. We will have police that are NYPD in New York or the French police, or we'll hire the Royal Canadian Mounties to come in and do the policing. But this will be a place where we stick to the rule of law. You'll get a ticket if you cross against the lights. Well, okay, maybe we won't use NYPD, but so this will be a place where the rule of law will happen. Well, then you will attract people. You'll get a selection effect for people who are more likely to protect the rule. And then if they live under conditions that they voluntarily opted into, that they're not familiar with, but they live under them, they wanted them, and they reinforce each other, they will quickly become acculturated and develop norms that support the rule of law. And they will have this visceral reaction that we all have when we see other people who violate the law, and they'll want to scold them, they'll want to punish them. It's the social effects that do a lot of the work in maintaining the order that comes from norms about crossing streets, or at a higher level, norms about the fundamentals of the rule of law. So I think the one contribution economists could make to this is to be clear about the distinction between preferences or norms that change through vertical mechanisms, parent to child, or horizontal mechanisms. I think accumulate the evidence, which shows, the vast amount of evidence shows that the majority of the transmission is horizontal, and then to think about how can we actually create mechanisms that will change norms. To give you one piece of evidence that this process can work, there's a very good book about New Zealand versus the United States called Freedom and Fairness. And it argues that these two countries were founded by people leaving Britain at different times. The people leaving Britain going to the United States was at a time when they wanted religious freedom. And rhetoric in the United States about right and wrong has emphasized freedom ever since, even though all kinds of people have migrated since then. But that founding population created a certain set of norms about politics and values, and those are norms that people assimilate into when they move there. In contrast, when people move to New Zealand, the focus was much more on economic opportunity and getting free of the inequality of the age of industrialization. So fairness plays a much larger role in the rhetoric, political rhetoric of New Zealand, but in the policies too. These countries are different in a persistent way because they had different founding populations. So look for fairness and freedom for a good history of these effects. So we have a chance, and it could be many different countries that could enforce norms in slightly different ways, but different countries could create cities with the rule of law as built in the way it was in Hong Kong, and that could give people the chance to live in the rule of law, quickly socialize them into these norms about the rule of law, and create opportunity places where they can go. I think once people in developed countries see that the people who might migrate in are actually already like they are in terms of some of these attitudes about the rule of law, I think fear of immigration would be much lower. So just as there were people who migrated from Hong Kong to Britain, I think you could see people migrating from some of these new cities into nations like the United States and France. But right now, the populists may have a point, which is that even though when the rate of immigration is low, so that people are socialized into the existing norms, if the rate is too high, the new immigrants, the new arrivals will slump the existing population, and through mechanisms like segregation, voluntary segregation often, or affiliation, they could create kind of strongholds of the norms that they bring from other countries or other cultures rather than places where the existing norms prevail. So that there may be a logical reason. We need to look at the facts, but at least from the perspective of the logic, there is presumably some rate of immigration into any country which would be so large that the migrants would swamp the existing population and could flip the culture that the existing citizens don't want. So there is at least a logically correct or valid reason why people are afraid of immigration. But as I say, I think if you can address some of this acculturation in other places analogous to Hong Kong, some of those fears may be diminished. And so even in the United States, this hypothetical zone on the US-Canada border, that might be the staging ground from which the US or Canada might be willing to welcome hundreds of thousands of people a year, millions a year maybe, into the rest of the country to become citizens there. So I think I've at least given you a hint at the underlying questions that need to be addressed. From in a formal perspective, what this has to be is a theory of preferences where people care about moral questions. They care about whether you cross the street when you're not supposed to. And in a place where everybody thinks you're supposed to cross the street only when the crossing sign is green, they will actually feel this desire, they'll have this preference for scolding you, for punishing you, for deviating from the norms. So we need to have preferences that can have that kind of desire for punishment of somebody who violates the norms. And we have to have a mechanism whereby we can absorb our notion of what's the right thing to do by looking at the people around us. But with that expanded notion of the preferences that economists use to describe behavior, you can then build a theory where the prevailing norms do matter, even to the point where nation states are guided by decisions about these prevailing norms. And you can think about whether mechanisms like selection or a particular set of rules which compel behavior, which then change norms, you can think about mechanisms that can lead to change in norms, and change in norms that could be the kind of change that many people would like to see. They would like to live in a place where people follow the rule of law. Many countries, they'd like to live in a place where people pay tax instead of having norms where they flaunt their ability to escape paying tax. So it would be better for everyone to have norms where people actually paid tax. So with an extended version of preferences, it's easy to have norms that are dynamic, and norms that influence behavior. And we could think about systems that could exploit or take advantage of the intrinsic human nature on these dimensions and create opportunities that we don't have right now. In particular, create a way for the billions of people who are trapped in places who don't have access to the kind of rule of law that we take for granted. We could create places where they could get access to it quickly and become themselves all people who have norms that support the rule of law. Now, to close up, well, how did things turn out in New Shenzhen and New Haven off the edge of Venezuela? Well, things can go well in some cities, they can go wrong in others. In New Haven, where the U.S. was very influential, or actually take NAFTAville, where the U.S. and Canada set it up on the border. They do what the United States does all the time, which is go in someplace and just run an election and think you're done. You've got a democracy and the rule of law established. And of course, they let go. They're no longer appointing the governor. And you get a dictator who controls the police force and subverts the election and so forth. And then US and Canada are left providing the kind of institutional cover for a system which is totally corrupt. And then they're going to try and think about how do we engage in state building in this failed state that we just built ourselves. I think that it will take a long time before you can actually get to the point where democracy works. Oh yes, in NAFTAville, the other ones in New Haven, they also turned to democracy too soon, and then they replicated the same experience we have in existing democracies. Once 1 million people were in the city, they voted against any more immigrants. They don't want any more immigrants because they're gonna, they have the same fears of immigrants that so you never get to 10 million people because they vote against immigration. So you may have to think about a system where you run it like Hong Kong with an appointed governor until it gets up to something like its 10 million or 20 million scale where it can't really grow anymore. And you may have to be slow about completely stepping away because it's very difficult to solve this problem of who guards the guardians and how do you protect someone who's strong enough to appoint and control the police force. How do you make sure that that person doesn't just subvert all of the mechanisms that hold that leader accountable? So I think this will force us to rethink the sequencing, not the importance, but the sequencing of rule of law relative to democracy. And as long as people can move to someplace where there's rule of law and a mechanism for holding accountable the executive in these places, like the governor of Hong Kong gets fired if he does a bad job or if he's corrupt, gets fired by the prime minister in the UK, who's in turn held accountable by voters in the UK. As long as there's a mechanism for accountability, people may be happy to live there and may not care if they can vote right away. They may even be more comfortable if they can't vote right away because they're not sure what their neighbors are going to do. And maybe her neighbors would disrupt the whole system. So I think the norms here that may be important going forward are, one, the Westphalian norms that nations have to give up on this idea that we can do humanitarian interventions or use our responsibility to protect our. We have to give up on the idea that that gives us an excuse to just go invade a country if we want to. It won't work if we do, and it has to be counter to all of our accepted norms. But we can still have norms that it's important to provide opportunity and deal with humanitarian crises, and we can do that by letting people leave. So the Westphalian norms, I think, have to be reinforced. Norms about the importance of the rule of law have to be established. And then eventually you can bring back in the mechanisms of democratic control. And you can also trigger the mechanisms that would make these provisional arrangements, like the agreement in Namibia that Germany is appointing the governor of this city in Namibia. At some point, that city becomes part of Namibia, and Germany is out of the loop. But that has to happen through a process where Namibians vote or approve it, and people in the same city vote or approve it. And it might take centuries for that kind of reintegration to take place. But we still support Westphalia in the sense that it's up to Namibia what it does inside its territory. But it's counter to a naive vision of Westphalia, because Namibia or any other country can enter into treaties, and those treaties can bind the countries, the leaders, and their successors. And, for example, put in place a mechanism whereby only through the following process can you reincorporate some new city as part of the nation. So, Westphalia, rule of law, democracy eventually, but maybe not right away. And then finally, I guess I've given the conclusion. The only thing that I think I didn't have time to reinforce is that we've seen attempts to try and let migrants come in to different countries, but where they're not afforded the same protection in law as existing citizens. This is one way to make existing citizens comfortable, is to basically give a special status to the new arrivals. It seems to be very corrosive in terms of achieving the goal of building respect for the people you're bringing in. By giving them different treatment, subjecting them to lesser standards, you typically build an oppositional culture, and like what we've seen in Sweden, for example, things like gang violence and killings because of the opposition that comes from the failure of equal treatment. So when I say rule of law, this very much assumes that rule of law means equal treatment under the law for everyone in one of these zones. So I hope I've gotten you on the cusp of thinking about arrangements that could be different. I know that I haven't addressed problems in the world. I don't see how these new cities directly do anything to address global warming. Global warming is likely to make the pressure for migration even worse, but these won't change that, except in the sense that if I'm right, that the fear of immigration and polarizing about immigrants, the us versus them mentality that some politicians can exploit, if this is what's causing our existing democracies to be paralyzed in a way that they weren't, say 30 years ago, when we were dealing with the problem of the ozone hole, where we had a problem like climate change that the world handled really very effectively. If immigration is part of what's undermining the established democracies, then removing it as a threat and having a credible way to deal with it at scale that is humane and that really fosters faster progress in the direction that everyone wants, then there's some hope that we get back to democratic systems that could make reasonable decisions about things like climate change. So I hope you at least have a sense that things could look different in the future, and that we could replicate even the handful of cities I've talked about to 50 or more if we have to provide room for everybody. And even if what I've outlined in any of its different flavors is not the right solution in your mind, or it turns out in practice it's not the right solution, I hope I've at least given you the sense there are more things we could consider in a way where we're mindful of the risks we're undertaking, consider in a way where we strengthen rather than undermine the existing system. And if we believe that we really could solve this problem, deal with it constructively, then we can leave this state we're in right now of denial, where all we say is, oh, we're going to make them stay there and we're going to do state building, because we're afraid to even think about why state building doesn't work, why this is just a pretense, it's not a solution. If we really think there are solutions, then we can have the courage to engage, and out of that engagement and discussion, what may emerge will be another change in the world system, like the change around Westphalia, or like the change from inherited monarchies to democratic decision making. I'm sure the world will get there, but I don't know if it'll be in my lifetime. Thank you.
So we will take a few questions from the ground. Yes, please. Go ahead.
Thank you so much. My name is Pashtun Zirak, and I'm from Afghanistan. I was the former student of SANSPO. It would be very nice that we talked about Afghanistan as well, but anyhow, I will just have a question. 22 years before the United Nations, the NATO countries came to Afghanistan, and they did more in terms of diplomacy, economic, social justice, freedom of speech, and each and everything. But after 20 years, in 2020, in the month of February, the same United Nations and NATO countries, they did an agreement with Taliban and hand over Afghanistan and 40 million of Afghans to a terrorist groups when we don't have anything. We would have regional connectivity, 10 projects going on in Afghanistan. They are stopped. And Afghanistan is again a landlocked country. So, in terms of this all, do you think Afghanistan is a threat to international security? The second question is, if anything happens in terms of security incident in the next 1 year, in next 5 years, will Afghanistan and Afghans will be responsible, or the United Nations or the NATO countries will be responsible, where they hand over 40 million of people in this situation and leave alone to the terrorist groups of Taliban? Thank you so much.
So I think my answer will not satisfy you, and I'm sorry, but it was because I will stay within this area of my professional expertise, which is to talk about what could happen or what will happen, but not what should. I do know what should happen, or at least I don't have any professional expertise in this, so I don't know who we should hold responsible. These are important kind of moral questions. I don't have anything to say about them. But I will tell you, I thought very seriously about Afghanistan when the United States was still there, because it was clearly going to be a tragedy if we pulled out. But it was also clear that we were not on a path that was going to succeed, that was sustainable. I thought hard about whether or not you could create a city-scale piece of land in Afghanistan, keep a U.S. presence there, and say to everyone who's afraid of what could happen under a new regime if the United States pulls back, you're safe to come in a Hong Kong-like place that we will commit to keep secure, because it's small. We can keep it secure for 100 years. The reason I concluded that the United States couldn't do that is because, as you say, Afghanistan is landlocked. And moreover, it's surrounded by countries that have, if anything, tried to make transport even harder. When the United States was there, it cost $10 a gallon to bring gasoline in for the US Army. So when I did the calculations, could I say that a new city in Afghanistan could pay for itself? Could it be a success the way Shenzhen was? I think right now, because of the transport costs, it can't. And so this is a harsh reality. But I think it might be clarifying to think about it too. That doesn't mean that there isn't a city that Afghanis could go to where they could be safe. It might not be in Afghanistan, but we could create it someplace else. I think if the United States had been willing, and clearly the United States is paralyzed right now, but if it had been willing, we could have created a place in, Somalia, or who knows? I mean, there's a number of places. We could have negotiated with, we could have created a place and said, we're going to keep this place safe for 100 years, and everybody from Afghanistan is free to come. Anybody from the region is free to come as well. And we could have done that without taking on a burden that we couldn't sustain. but it would have taken a leap of imagination, I think, for US citizens that they couldn't make. And frankly, I think many Afghanis would just refuse outright the prospect that, that they should move to get access to the kind of protection under the rule of law that they'd like to have. But sometimes the constraints are such that we have to say we can't reach the ideal, and we'll have to select between these alternatives, which are less than ideal. But I wish, as a citizen, I wish the United States had at least said to everyone in Afghanistan, here's a place you can go, you can live there forever, like people can home, never have to worry about getting kicked out. There's a place you can go, especially if you're a woman, it's a place you can go, you can be safe, and you don't have to live under a regime that will abuse you. I wish we had done that, but we didn't.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Hi, Dr. Omer. My name is Joe Hao. I am a first-year master's student at the School of Research. So thank you so much for flying all the way over to Paris from New York and giving this very bold vision for a possible way for the world to progress. I have a few questions and concerns about the vision, and I do recognize that...
I was going to say, the way to show respect to me is tell me how I'm wrong. This is what economists or academics do as colleagues. So by all means, tell me where you think I'm wrong.
Thank you. Thank you. So I do recognize that the time frame of an hour of keynote speech is not sufficient enough to cover all the nuances and concerns. But when I was listening to your speech, the concept of carving out a piece of land in a foreign country run by this absentee and hypothetically with stronger economic power, stronger military power, foreign country, that sounds a lot like another concept that was pretty much the theme of 19th century politics, which is colonialism. Yeah. Now, I'm not assigning a moral judgment to whether it's good or bad, but a lot of people will. So, yeah. First question.
Well, but just look, I mean, I've been around this like 1,000 times, and all I can do is just repeat what I've said before, which is think, don't feel. Okay? This might make you feel like colonialism, but it's your obligation. I mean, if you're going to be a scholar, you gotta think. And if you're going to criticize, you got to think. And think about, is this similar to colonialism, or is this different? So it's not enough to just tell me it feels like colonialism. Tell me what's different.
So from a scholar's perspective, it's definitely my job to think in more nuances, but just considering the conditions that a lot of people are living under, they do not necessarily have the leisure, they do not necessarily have the information, the resources to really go into the details and look for and weigh the cost and benefit of this proposal. So, which is why I'm saying that a lot of people might feel, and it is also these people whose consent really matters, right? Of your high emphasis on individual choice. Now, for example, if there is going to be a new city built in, let's say, in a country that is not very developed, the people there, they do not necessarily have the information to think through all the nuances, and they will feel that it's like colonialism.
But let me just ask about some facts. Are you saying you don't think people would move into one of these new cities, or you think they might move into one of these new cities, but they'll be taken advantage of in some way and we shouldn't allow it?
I'm saying neither. So regarding your first follow-up question, whether people will move into these new cities, yes, I think there's a high chance that they will, because there's more opportunities and stuff like that. But then when they're in these new cities, it's quite imaginable that the absentee sovereignty over this city may not necessarily understand the nuances of local politics, and they may not necessarily put the welfare of the local people at their top priority. which is what has happened, especially in Hong Kong during the first, 100 years of colonization under British rule. So
I think people who kept moving to Hong Kong were very happy with the system under Britain. And there was no pressure for local elections in Hong Kong until it became clear that China was going to take over. So I think you got the facts wrong about Hong Kong.
but
Okay, we will let some other individuals get into the discussion. So please, yes.
Thank you. I think we just touched on a really interesting aspect of the discussion, which is indeed, and perhaps it extends a little bit further beyond this really interesting concept. So by all means, feel free to defer this question. But as with any resident in any geographical area, and especially when assuring an improved sense of welfare, ultimately that comes down to public services. Access to law enforcement is what you mentioned. Also, perhaps healthcare or adequate housing. And I'm just curious, what would this look like underneath this kind of zone state? How would citizens not only receive an adequate level of public services that they may not be receiving in their origin destinations, but also how are they somewhat protected as they may be in their origin destinations from international market exploitation if it is open to international firms and investment? It's easy to imagine people living in, as you mentioned, suboptimal living conditions and also being involved in international exploitation. Thank you.
Okay, so am I correct that what you're saying is that people might move into these cities, but you fear that we would be doing them a disservice and we'd be better off forcing them to stay where they are?
I'm worried that vulnerable populations will be given.
Well, no, but you have to answer my question. Would it be better for us to keep saying to them, you have to stay where we are? We'll make you drowned if you try and get into Europe. We'll do everything we can to make it impossible for you to leave where we are. Is that, do you think, the best way to help them?
I think it's all about making their origin destinations more livable.
But at the scale of 750 million people, we're not going to get anywhere if we talk about charity. Okay?
Absolutely.
So this has to be a story where you create opportunity and people benefit from it. And you have to trust that people actually make decisions about where they'll be better off.
And who would be accepting these applications in the zones? Would it be the governments that purchased the land?
Yeah, it'll be like Hong Kong. And by the way, I don't think absentee is the way Hong Kong was run, but the local governor, the local administration, staffed by people who move in and live in this city, would make decisions. But I think if you want to make this city succeed, you want to let a lot of people in, just like New York City did in the early days. I think it's an important question that people might not be true that people have enough information to make decisions about what's in their best interest. So it's a legitimate question to raise. But I think if we look at the facts on this, what we'll see is that when migrants move, they're moving from horrific conditions to conditions we might still think are bad. And we wish they were good. But I think most people would say that if it's a choice between horrific and bad, I want bad for my kids.
Okay, we have time for one more question, please. Yes. Yes, go ahead.
Should I?
Yeah, go ahead.
Hi. Thank you so much for the talk. I had a question about the practical aspect of choosing a city because your solution is the solution to a problem of a humanitarian crisis. And I know it's going to take long. And there will be rewards, but there will be a burden. My question is that how will you choose the cities so that these burdens are shared more homogeneously? And the reason that I'm asking that, if you permit me, I'm going to address the elephant for myself. I am Turkish, and my country hosts massive numbers of Syrian refugees because there was a massive humanitarian crisis. Turkey alone hosts 3.6 million refugees, whereas Europe hosts 1 million, half of it being in Germany. I know that these people absolutely need new places, but when we talk about these issues, I'm sorry, but it kind of makes me feel like that these problems are contained in a broad lens, and maybe you could elaborate a bit more on that, on how the cities should be chosen.
I'm afraid I may not have understood some of the early parts of your question, so feel free to correct. But the second part about Turkey, I think I can respond to. I think it's, again, these questions about fairness, I don't think I have any expertise on. But my impression is that many Turkish citizens are uncomfortable with so many refugees living in Turkey. And certainly if it increased by a factor of 10, it became 30 million, there would be a backlash in Turkey. So I think, without saying should, I think the reality is that we can't keep going down a path where countries like Turkey take on board millions and millions of people. So what I'm conjecturing, though, is if Turkey were the one to acquire a piece of land someplace and say, look, we can't make you Turkish citizens, but we can create for you a place that's safe and better for you to live. And if Turkey could even do this in a way that doesn't mean taking away from Turkish taxpayers, I think that the voters and the citizens in Turkey would be happier with that alternative than the one they're living with right now. So I think these ideas could actually offer a better outcome for Turkish citizens, one they would prefer over the one that they're living with right now.
Okay, thank you very much.
Was there a part of that I misunderstood? Or?
Don't get me wrong, I don't think that what you explain is a bad solution. What I'm questioning is, in practice, where will this land be? Because you're saying like Turkey should acquire some land, but most of the time what happens is that the land is gonna be inside of a territory of some country. In our case, it's in our country. So to me, this sounds like contamination of a problem abroad from European borders.
Well, what I'm trying to say is I don't have to say about is this fair or are people in different countries doing the right thing. But what I do have to say is I think we're underestimating the possibility of Turkey to find a place where millions of people from the Middle East could go. And I think, as I was trying to suggest with the United States and Canada, it could even be in Turkey, but I think done in a way where they do not become Turkish citizens. They don't get the same benefit that Turkish citizens do. But if Turkish voters are not in favor of that, I think Turkey could find another place where they could do this. And I think the people who could go move there would be better off if they could go to a place where it was a more permanent solution. And I think voters and Turkish citizens would be happier with an arrangement that's different from the one that we now have.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Paul Roma. Thank you.